Good afternoon. I have heard that Professor Lee has been stirring it up and creating controversy. That's a good thing. My title this afternoon is From Signal to Symbol to System, the Emergence of Language. And I try here directly to lead on from the issues that I was talking about this morning by trying to give an account precisely to this question of if language is a symbolic system which is used for conceptualization and representation, how did this come about? How did this amazing capacity come about, and how did this tool that we use every day, almost without thinking about it, how did it come about in evolution? Now, here is an evolutionary developmental puzzle. If we look at ourselves as biological organisms, many of the neurocognitive prerequisites for language and some of the cultural prerequisites are present in non-human communication and cognition. We are actually very like other primate species. Of course, we're different as well, but a lot of it is similar. Also, humans share a very large proportion of genetic material with non-human animals. Maybe I should just expand that a little bit. We know that the human genome has between 95% and 98% identical material with those of our closest living relatives, chimpanzees. But evolutionary modern human natural languages are qualitatively different from any other communication system. So even though we're so similar, we are also, in terms of the communication system that we use, completely different. Why? What's the solution to this puzzle? Here's an outline solution. The evolution of language from some kind of proto-language was, I will suggest, mainly dependent upon extrasomatic sociocultural processes. By extrasomatic, I mean things that were going on outside the body, not inside. I will stress here that language is a normative and conventional system, which we've already talked about, and that both language development and evolution must be conceptualized in an epigenetic and socio-naturalistic framework. I used there the term epigenetic, and I need to explain to you what is epigenesis. Epigenesis is a process of development of organisms. It is a process in which the role of the environment in development is constructive and not just selective. It's a process in which an initial repertoire is elaborated through experience of a relevant environment, and in which organismic plasticity and informational openness yields to relative, although not complete, rigidity and informational closure. Now, this is quite a technical definition, and I need to explain it a little bit better. Traditionally, there has been a distinction between theories of learning and theories in which behaviors are innate. In theories in which behaviors are innate, as it were, nothing is really contributed by the environment. A typical theory of innate behavior and knowledge is Chomsky's theory of language acquisition. According to Chomsky, each human being is born with a universal grammar module, a basic knowledge of language which is innate. And this universal grammar is characterized by a number of principles of organization which can take different specific forms according to the particular language which the child is exposed to. And these principles are therefore consist of a series of different parameters. So, for example, word order, subject, verb, object versus verb, object, subject. And the idea is that when the child is exposed to a particular language, that exposure triggers a particular parameter switch. So there is a kind of switch which turns the developmental process one way or the other. But actually, the environment doesn't really add any information, because the information is already there in the genes, in the encoding of the innate knowledge. And in contrast, in an epigenetic approach, we have a relatively simple initial repertoire, which you can think of, if you like, as being innate, but it is, I will give an example of this in a minute. But that repertoire is elaborated through experience of a relevant environment, and the environment itself contributes to increasing complexity. Also, in epigenetic development, actually is taking place in a manner which is irreversible. That is to say, more and as the information comes in and the system builds itself up, the system becomes less and less open to new information, and so it becomes more and more of a closed system, which is not going to turn back to its previously simple state. Again, we'll explain this in greater detail as we go along. Now, I'm going to combine this, as you might expect, with a cognitive functional approach to language development, in which to learn a language is to learn to communicate symbolically, in which symbolic communication involves a conventional mapping from conceptualization to expression, and in which natural languages are considered to be flexible, multi-level symbolic systems. So, the mapping in natural languages is from conceptualization to expression, and that is exactly what I was talking about this morning, in which expression, what is sometimes called form, is motivated by conceptualization, what is sometimes called content. And at the same time, conceptualization is shaped by expression. In other words, the resources that we have given by our language for conceptualizing the situations that we wish to refer to are shaping, in some kind of sense, the way in which the conceptualization occurs. And finally, again, as I said this morning, all linguistic conceptualization is contextually situated in a universe of discourse. That is, the universe communication which language gives us. Now, what about grammar in this cognitive functional perspective? In cognitive functional linguistics, grammar is not merely a system of rules at the level of form or expression. Now, this is quite important, and perhaps it's something which other speakers in this series have made a lot of. As you know, in traditional grammars, the kind of grammars which tend to be used in schools and universities for teaching foreign languages, grammars tell us how to put together constructions, focusing on the form. This idea that grammars are about form is also preserved in generativist linguistics. And that's why, in a sense, we can talk about these as formalist approaches within linguistics. Cognitive linguistics is different, because in cognitive linguistics, grammar is not just a system of rules at the level of form or expression. It's a conventional system of mappings from conceptualization to expression. So if you want to take the whole system, conceptualization, mapping rules or mapping schemas, if you like, and expression schemas, if you want to take the whole thing together, then you can actually say meaning is part of grammar. And that, of course, is the basic insight which Langacker has given us in his cognitive grammar. So in terms of learning language, it is not the case that there are separate processes of lexical learning, morphological learning, and syntax learning. No, it's all one process. Learning syntax is continuous with learning lexicon and learning morphology. At this point, I'm going to remind you of some notions that came up yesterday. It's just a reminder. I don't have very much to say. Important notions are figure and ground, their development by people like Langacker into trajectory and landmark, and building on those notions, we can talk about the basic principles of cognitive functional motivation. These are the basic principles that motivate the pathways or schemas between linguistic conceptualization and linguistic expression. The first of these is iconicity and analogy. As an example of iconicity, let's take word order frequencies in the languages of the world. In very many languages, we find a word order of subject, object, verb. We also find quite a large number of word order languages which are with the word order subject, verb, object, and some more which are verb, subject, object. There are almost no languages, a very, very small number, in which the object is canonically the first mentioned syntactic constituent. Why should that be? The most simple answer is an iconicity answer, and that is that in our perception of events and our segmentation of event structures, our partition of events into an event schema, the salient aspects and the first occurring aspects are the agent and the action, not the patient or the object. And language just mirrors that salient structure in perception and event parsing. So, There are very many phenomena in language which are to do with iconicity, and there's a linguist called John Heyman who has done a lot of work on this. Analogy. Analogy is essentially, very simply, the process whereby new expressions are formed by analogy with older expressions, and we get innovation in language, and we get patterns propagating themselves through the system, recruiting new members to that pattern. Let me give you a rather simple example. We can say in English, the street is closed off. Okay, so we have the verb closed, which is to do with accessibility to motion, and the off is a satellite term, to use Talmiz's expression, which really means something to do with the prohibition of motion through that obstacle. Okay, so I think in some kind of way, closed off is a sort of expression for a force dynamic schema, for those of you who are familiar with Talmiz's work. But we can also say, at least in British English, if the police shut off a street by putting these traffic cones in front of the entrance, we can say the street is coned off. Yeah? Now what's happening here is that a noun, cone, is being used as a verb, and it's being used as a verb in a particular construction frame. And its original meaning, the original meaning of that noun, cone, has got nothing to do with accessibility to motion whatsoever. But put it in that construction frame, and everybody knows exactly what you're saying. And the analogy process is creating a new expression, which is actually a new kind of conceptualization as well, which is very economically expressed through analogy, and which is not ambiguous at all, and which, quite honestly, nobody even notices that it's something new. But the minute that you notice these kinds of things, and you go and look, in English at any rate, at the incredible frequency with which verbs turn into nouns, and nouns turn into verbs in very specific construction frames, you see that analogy is everywhere in language. The next basic principle of cognitive functional motivation, which we have already talked about, is figure-ground organization, which is fundamental to flexible construal. So that we can say, for example, let's make a slightly different example. Let's talk about, instead of the lamp and the table, let's talk about the microphone and the computer. I can say the microphone is over the computer, or I can say the computer is under the microphone. Yeah? In the first case, the microphone is the trajector or figure, and the computer is the landmark or ground. And in the second case, it's changed around. A third principle of cognitive functional motivation is topic-comment organization. This is, of course, particularly relevant to Chinese because I don't speak Chinese. I know very little about Chinese. And one of the few things, little bits of general linguistic knowledge that I know is that Chinese is a topic language rather than a subject language, or is often characterized this way. And topicalization is another way in which we can flexibly construe situations, and of course in such a way that we can do that for the benefit of more effective communication with the listener. So a typical example here, let's carry on with our microphone and computer example would be, instead of saying the computer is under the microphone, we could say under the microphone is the computer, okay? And actually, especially in English, these kinds of topicalization devices, heightening profiling and so on, or heightening prominence perhaps, are often used for poetic effect. So instead of saying something like, the night was dark, we can say something like, dark was the night, which emphasizes the quality of the attribute. A fourth principle of cognitive functional motivation is perspective and profiling. And here English offers a number of interesting examples of relatively subtle distinctions. Let's take this first pair here. The girl in the picture and the girl on the poster. Now, a picture, as you all know, is a two-dimensional surface. And anything that is actually part of that picture is part of that two-dimensional surface. Yeah? And whether it's a painted picture or a printed poster doesn't matter, does it? Physically speaking, it's all part of essentially the same two-dimensional surface. But in a representational picture, something like a landscape with human figures in it, we would be likely to pick out one of those human figures by talking about the girl in the picture, or the girl with the hat in the picture, or something like that, yeah? You can all form a mental image of this, yes? But if we're talking about a poster, say a poster advertising, I don't know, a theatre event or a rock concert or something like that, and there is a kind of prominent picture of a girl kind of leaping out at you, we're more likely in English to say the girl on the poster. And in fact, it would be very strange to say the girl in the poster. Why is that? It's the same thing, but we use two different prepositions. Well, it's to do with our old friend perspective. When we talk about the girl in the picture, the kind of virtual observer, as it were, or the point of view which is adopted in the linguistic construal is one which has got a kind of three-dimensional depth to it. So that actually the point of view is one which comprehends the interiority of the scene. So we say the girl in the picture in the same way that we would say the girl in the room or the girl in the field. But when it's a poster is very much a two-dimensional object and construed and conceptualized as such. And the point of view adopted is an entirely external point of view in which we view the figure as being on the poster in the same way that the poster is on the wall. So we say the girl on the poster. Exactly the same principle applies if you think of two expressions like the boat on the lake and the boat in the lake. The expression, they might be exactly the same physical situation, okay? There's a boat, and the boat is floating in the water in a lake, okay? But imagine that you're in a plane, and you're flying over the lake, and you're looking down at this scene from quite a long distance, and you look down and you say, there's a boat on the lake. But imagine, on the contrary, that you're down there on the bank of the lake and you want to get the boat in the water and you say, let's put the boat in the lake. Okay, it's a matter of perspective, proximity, and point of view. And these are phenomena which, before cognitive linguists started to pay attention to them, were never actually looked at in linguistics, because linguistics did not take account of human cognitive processes and the principles of cognitive and functional motivation. And another example, of course, which we very much owe to Lanaka, is the example of kinship terms. Where we can take, for example, the same individual, we can say, for example, Sarah is the mother of Jane, but we can also say Sarah is the daughter of Sally. And the lexical expressions mother and daughter both involve the profiling of one pole, if you like, of a bipolar relationship of kinship and descent. So kinship terms, in their very semantics, involve point of view and profiling and perspective. Given these principles of motivation, what kind of features of complexity do we find in the languages of the world? We certainly find grammatical complexity. Although, beyond nouns and verbs, it is not certain that any other grammatical classes are truly universal. All languages employ a rich variety of grammatical structures. As a matter of fact, I've even heard on one occasion one linguist deny that even nouns are universal, but I'm not sure that I really believe that. But it is true that there is quite a variety in terms of the organization of form classes between different languages. But it is also true that grammatical complexity is a general feature of languages. And of course, it's that dimension of complexity which generative linguists have seized upon in saying that language is a particularly complex and indeed, according to them, unlearnable system. But what I want to say is that this grammatical complexity has to be situated within the framework of other dimensions of complexity as well, such as symbolic complexity, involving all of these dimensions of flexible construal and alternate conceptualization, which I have been talking about, and also involving displacement, or this capacity for virtual conceptualization, the reference to spatially and temporally remote, imaginary, and unobservable things and events, employing systematic constructional means to do so. There is also what we might call cognitive pragmatic complexity, because amongst the cognitive semantic resources of all languages are resources which specify location and relations, both static and dynamic, in space and time, the manner of movement of objects, or the manner of occurrence of events, relations of probability, certainty, obligation, and evidentiality, deictic relations between speaker, hearer, and third parties, logical and coherence relations between discourse units, number, definiteness, and or classification, and the performative force of the speech act. All languages are able not only to actually perform particular pragmatic functions, but they're able to, as well as actually do the function, they're able to mark the function and to actually perform the function through the marking. And that's what the philosopher John Searle calls performativity, or performative speech acts. So that includes the use of such verbs as promise, or deny, or warn. So if I say to somebody, I promise I'll pay you back that £5 tomorrow, then what I'm doing is, in uttering the term promise, the verb promise, which is a performative verb, in uttering that verb, I am actually performing the promise. And there isn't really any other way that we can actually incur that particular obligation towards the listener except by uttering that performative verb. And that's why people, in fact, place such importance on such performative verbs. So, for example, somebody says, I'll come tomorrow, and the listener might say, do you promise? Yes, all right, I promise, yeah? Now think about this for a moment. There are very many communication systems in the animal world in which communicative functions are actually carried out, as it were, by communicative signals, which we'll be getting onto in a minute. But there are no communication systems in the animal world which involve the use of anything like a performative utterance. And I'll give you an example of that. A dog, for example, can certainly convey in some kind of way the fact that it's threatening, okay? A dog can growl and bare its teeth and sort of adopt a posture with its front down and its haunches up and its tail sort of straight, not wagging, and its eyes kind of looking very fierce, okay? And any of us coming across a dog adopting that posture and making those kinds of noises will know that that dog is adopting what we would call a threat position, okay? But one thing a dog can't do is say, I'm warning you, okay? It can't do that. And in human languages we can. We have this amazing reflexivity in communicative function. And all languages can do all of those things. And this is, so we have an extraordinary richness of dimensions of complexity. Now, I seem to have done something wrong with this slide here. Next slide is to do with flexible construal and symbolic power, and I'm going to give you some examples, although I think in a way we've done this already. The cup is on the saucer is under the cup. Here's an example taken from Talmy. The actual example is not, but the kind of phenomenon is taken from him. He calls it fictive or virtual motion. We can use expressions like the tunnel goes from Dover to Calais. Now, Dover is a town in England, and Calais is a town in France. And they are at, each of them is a coastal town on the English Channel which separates England from France. And as you probably know, there is actually a tunnel which connects England and France, which goes underneath the English Channel, yeah? So we can say the tunnel goes from Dover to Calais. But wait a minute, actually the tunnel doesn't go anywhere. In fact, if it did, that would be a very bad thing. It would be a pretty bad piece of engineering if it was too movable. In reality, what we're doing is we are conceptualizing the path, the direction of path of the tunnel as a stative, or in a stative locative relationship, we're conceptualizing that by imaginatively adopting the point of view of a human being traveling through the tunnel, which of course is what the tunnel is built for. And interestingly, we're doing it from the perspective of a traveller who starts in England and ends up in France. So that would be usually uttered by somebody on the English side of the tunnel, whereas somebody on the French side of the tunnel would be more likely to say the tunnel goes from Calais to Dover. Huh? But note, we can go further than that. We can say things like, the competition will run throughout the entire weekend. Or perhaps earlier this year, we could have said something like, the Olympics will run for most of August and September. Now, actually, competitions or institutional events like the Olympic Games do not actually run. They do not engage in physical motion. So what we have here is a metaphoric extension of the virtual motion construction to talk about temporal duration. And we're using the symbolic power of language. And by the way, and incidentally, I hope you notice that actually when we use, if we go from something like the tunnel goes from Dover to Calais to something like the competition will run throughout the entire weekend, this is an example of the cognitive functional principle of motivation, which we've called analogy. Okay? It's a construction through analogy. And then finally, when we start to use verbs like run with that kind of meaning, we can use typical Lakoff and Johnson kind of metaphoric expressions, like saying something like, the speaker is running out of time, which actually I hope I'm not, but I'd better get on, really. Okay. Now, signals versus symbols. That's part of my title. I want to draw a distinction between signals, which are the basic communication devices which are used throughout the animal kingdom, and symbols. And let's start by talking about signals. A signal is an instruction, possibly coded, to behave. Think of that dog and its kind of threat posture. The dog is trying to kind of get you to go away, right, basically. And a communicative signal, which the dog signal is a stimulus emitted under stimulus control, usually by a conspecific, a member of the same species. But as the dog example shows, not always, because the dog can also warn a human in that, or threaten a human in that way as well. So signaling is communication by the coordination of individual behavior. Signals are by definition indexical, if you want to use the Peircean semiotics. I just want to say a little bit about this. Signaling is communication by the coordination of individual behavior. By that, I mean that signaling is a process which takes place from one individual organism to another. And it doesn't necessarily involve what I will be calling shared meanings or intersubjectivity. And communication by signals is ubiquitous in the animal world. It happens all the time, and humans do it too. And a lot of what is often called paralinguistic features, including gesturing, including large parts of intonation and prosody, but also what is often called informally body language is to do with signal systems. And much of it we're not even conscious of. And here is a diagram of the signal system, of a simple signal. Now this is a diagram of a non-communicative signal to which an animal might respond. Could be anything. Say, for example, you have here a signal which is the presence of some kind of food, and the organism responds to that signal by eating the food. Yeah. Now that is the kind of diagram which at least psychologists are familiar with from traditional classical learning theory. But let's make it a little bit more complicated and talk about signaling systems which are used for animal communication. Here we have a communicative signal in which something happens in the world which impinges in some way on an organism, which emits a response which is itself a communicative signal, which is then picked up by a second organism and responds with some kind of indicated behavior. And I will try to make this a little bit more concrete by talking about the research conducted by two researchers in primatology called Cheney and Seafarth. And they studied a colony of a species of West African, I think West African, I'm not sure, anyway African, a species of monkeys called vervet monkeys. And they discovered that these vervet monkeys basically talk to each other. They use communicative signals. And their communication system consisted of a variety of vocal calls. And in fact, they distinguished three kinds of calls. I don't know what they sounded like, but the researchers could distinguish between the three calls, and so could the monkeys. Now, each of these calls was actually a warning call in functional terms. And each one of these calls was associated with a particular predator, which is dangerous for the vervet monkey. And the three predators are eagles, leopards, and snakes. And for each call, the monkeys who listened to it or heard it engaged in a particular kind of behavior. For example, if they heard the eagle call and they were up towards the top of the tree, they would go down the tree. If they heard the leopard call, they would go further up the tree. And if they were on the ground and they heard the snake call, the monkey would get up on two legs and sort of scan at the ground around it. So this is a really amazingly compact and yet very effective communication signal system. If you see a monkey, if you see an eagle, okay, there's an eagle, that's the stimulus. Organism number one sees this eagle, utters the eagle call, and all the other little vervet monkeys climb down out of the tree, right? Now notice something about this. In order for this to function effectively as an evolutionary kind of useful communication system, they don't really actually have to know anything about what's going on in each other's heads. And they don't have to be orienting towards the same shared piece of reality. There's no necessary intersubjectivity involved. It's just a kind of chain, almost a mechanical chain of stimulus and response. Now, it's kind of difficult to know how much these monkeys do know about meaning and so on, but I would suspect not very much. And you don't need to attribute complex understanding of meaning to them, because the signal system just works like that. It's almost a chain reaction. And I want to contrast that with human language, which is based not on signals, but on symbols. Conventional symbol systems, including the multi-level symbol system of human language, are grounded in an intersubjective meaning field. They're grounded in shared meanings. Symbols, to continue a theme which we talked about this morning, are representational. Speakers represent, through symbolic action, some segment or aspect of reality for hearers. And it is this representational function which is unique to symbolization, and also is precisely what distinguishes a symbol from a signal. Symbolic representation also is intentional. In other words, there is an intention, a communicative intention involved in the uttering of a symbolic utterance. Now, when we think about signals like the vervet monkey signal, we are not sure whether they're intentional in real terms, whether there is an intention to communicate. I don't want to say that there isn't, but we can't be sure that there is. Whereas with symbolic communication, we can always be sure that there is. And this is a diagram that I use to illustrate the representational function of symbolic communication. And it is based upon Karl Bühler's, what he called the organon model of language, organon being the Greek word for tool. So here, language is a symbolic tool which enables the speaker to construct an expression, a symbolic expression, which represents in some way a linguistically conceptualized referent, appealing to the hearer to also share this aspect of the world with the speaker. And importantly, speaker and hearer share a mental orientation towards the referent. And it is that mental orientation which, at the highest level of organization, we call construal. At its minimal level of organization, it might just be sharing attention. Here is this term intersubjectivity that I keep using, cropping up again in relation to symbols. Remember I said that signals are instructions to behave. When a vervet monkey hears the eagle signal, that vervet monkey has actually got to do something and do it sharp, do it quickly. Yeah? Whereas with a symbol, they're not directly oriented to changing people's behavior. They may be indirectly, but they're more directed to guiding the construal of the hearer or interpreter or receiver, or at least at a minimum, guiding their attention, as in see that cup over there. This can only occur within an intersubjectively shared field of joint reference, minimally joint attention, and maximally a symbolically constructed and shared universe of discourse. What about intentionality? I said symbol usage is intentional. What do we mean by intentional? That's a kind of difficult question, because intentionality is itself a concept which is much disputed by psychologists, philosophers, and linguists. I want to distinguish between three meanings of intentionality. The first meaning is intentionality as purposiveness or goal-directedness. That is the usual meaning of the word intentional in English. If somebody, say if a child comes along and kicks a football through my window, breaking my window, right? I go out and say, "Did you do that on purpose?" "No, mister, it was an accident." Right? Obviously, on the one hand, if they did it on purpose, it was intentional. If it was really an accident, it was not intentional, but an unintended consequence. There is a second meaning of intentionality, which is particularly focused on by some philosophers, and that is the notion of intentionality as directedness to the directedness to the world or reference. Or at least the idea is this, that we can have our attention or our perception or our thoughts can all be directed to the world, and so can our language, or at least our, let's say, our linguistic utterances. And when linguistic utterances have this intentional directedness, that's what we call reference. As in, that cup there, yeah, or you see that cup, okay, that's reference. Or even if I just hold it up there and I don't say anything, okay, there's no linguistic reference, but still, if you're paying attention to it, you are intentionally directing your attention to it. Finally, there is a third notion of intentionality, a derived higher level notion of intentionality, which we almost might call something like meta-intentions, which is our orientation not to some aspect of the world, but to other people. Our orientation towards them as minded beings who themselves have intentions and who are perspectively situated experiences in the same way that we are. And in that sense, intentionality, this third level of intentionality, is a kind of intersubjective intentionality. Symbolic communication is intentional, and it is intentional in all three senses. It's the purpose of use by a speaker of a symbolic sign to manipulate or direct the mental orientation of a hearer with respect to an intersubjectively shared referential situation. So the purpose of use by the speaker is the first level or definition of intentionality. The referential situation involves the second level of intentionality, and to manipulate or direct the mental orientation of a hearer is the third level of intentionality. And that mental orientation of the hearer may be full-blown linguistic construal, or it may be something as simple as sharing attention. So it could be just joint attention. And by the way, for those of you who are interested in Persian semiotics, this suggests that even indices and icons can therefore also be symbols when they're used symbolically or representationally. And that connects to the point that I made this morning when I showed you the map, that iconic and symbolic signs can collaborate together when they're appropriately used to serve the representational function. Now, from this analysis, we can start to construct a scenario for the evolutionary emergence of symbolization. First, let's just imagine something quite simple like the vervet monkey setup. The vervet monkey setup in which there is a sender of a signal and a receiver of a signal. But let's now suppose that the receiver comes to pay attention to the sender as the source of communicative signals. Okay? So vervet monkeys start to really kind of notice that it's other vervet monkeys who are giving off these signals, and they start to track the other members of their community, watching out for when they start to make signals. Okay? And this is almost the beginning, not quite yet, but it's a sort of little seed for a shared communication, an intersubjectively shared world of communication. The sender comes to pay attention to the receiver as a recipient of some kind of communicated information. So now we have a kind of mutuality emerging in which the members of the community are paying attention to each other, both as senders and receivers. And then the receiver, the third step, the receiver starts to pay attention to the evidential reliability of the sender's signals as a source of information by checking what the sender is paying attention to or doing. Well, why would they want to do that? Well, the answer is that in animal societies, and certainly in non-human primate societies, which have been studied by primatologists, a lot of deceptive signaling goes on. A lot of attempt, as it were, to deceive the person who is receiving a signal. And why is that? Well, it's to do with the two basic things which are important in the lives of non-human primates, which is food and sex. What they often try to do is to conceal the fact that they're paying attention to some potential source of food so that nobody else gets hold of it before they do. And they also try to conceal the fact that they're having sex with another member of the group because they might get punished by somebody higher up in the hierarchy for having sex with usually male having sex with the female. So there's a lot of evolutionary benefit in paying attention to not only what the sender is, as it were, signaling, but also what the sender is actually doing. And that opens up the way to some kind of monitoring of attention. And we are beginning to get here into a truly intersubjectively shared field. And then finally, the sender comes to pay attention to the receiver's readiness to reliably act upon the information sent by paying attention to what the receiver is paying attention to or doing, because it is advantageous if the signal is acted on in a way which the sender wishes it to be acted upon. So all of this is, as it were, a little story, a rather artificial story, but nonetheless a scenario, if you like, which helps to account for how, once you reach a level of signaling which is similar perhaps to that of the vervet monkey, out of this, through evolutionary selection, a symbol system might emerge. Now, I want us to come back. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about human development in the ontogenetic sense. And my 2 lectures tomorrow, by the way, are both going to be about cognitive and language development in children. So this is almost a kind of transition from the evolutionary biological to the ontogenetic. And then later in the lecture series, we'll be coming back to the biological and evolutionary. Remember this morning I talked about the dual grounding of language. Sensory motor grounding, which is embodied grounding in the perceptuo-motor system in its ecological niche, and discursive grounding, embodied grounding in pre-linguistic communication. And I will show you again now this diagram, which I think I showed in the first lecture, which is the notion which we owe to Vygotsky of the convergence of 2 lines of development, sensory motor and pre-linguistic communication, eventuating in symbolic communication. And I want to talk to you now, for the rest of this, most of the rest of this lecture, about communication between infants and their caretakers. A developmental psychologist called Colwyn Trevarthen has looked at the interaction patterns between very young babies and their mothers. And he finds that there are communications of a nature that he calls primary intersubjectivity. In primary intersubjectivity, we have an essentially closed communication circuit, and one which is characterized very much by the responsivity of the mother to the baby and the imitation by the baby of the facial expressions, vocalizations, and the timing of the movement which are made by the mother. The mother largely controls the interaction by being responsive to the baby. But you could also say that the baby is taking initiatives in these, what Trevarthen calls proto-conversations, by taking the initiative by actually coming out sometimes with new movements, new expressions. But the important thing about primary intersubjectivity is that it's not it's not about the sharing of communicative intentions in any symbolic sense. It's much more about the sharing of the simple experience of, as it were, being together. And something very interesting about primary intersubjectivity is that the timing of it is very important. And Trevarthen has worked together with a musician who is also a music theorist. And what he finds is that the kind of rhythm of interaction is very similar to the rhythms that we find in music. And there is nothing else in any other species which is like this. So this orientation towards the other is something unique to the human species. And you can find it, according to Trevarthen, as early as about 3 hours after birth. From about 6 months of age, the circuit of primary intersubjectivity starts to open up to the outside world. Infants start to be able to monitor the gaze of their caretaker. The mother looks at something and the baby sort of follows their gaze more or less in the same direction. So they're building up a kind of zone of joint attention. It's not yet true joint attention. We'll see in the next slide what that involves. But it is the beginning of responsiveness towards the attention of another, which is the beginning of that third level of intentionality, remember? Which is paying attention to or an orientation towards another person as a minded being. Already happening from 6 months of age. True joint attention is what Trevarthen calls secondary intersubjectivity. It appears around about 10 months of age, certainly between 9 and 12 months, usually around 10. And that's when both participants in an interaction are able not only to follow the gaze of the other, but also to manipulate it. So, for example, the baby can follow a point by the mother and can also, in the beginning, turn their head towards something and expect that the mother will follow that gaze. And even around about 12 months of age, will start to produce the pointing gestures themselves, doing things like, and expecting the mother or other caretaker to follow. So now, I think you've got truly something else, which is you've got true intersubjectivity. And this intersubjectivity is often directed to a genuine figure in joint attention. So you have a real figure-ground situation, and there is a sharing of the figure against the ground. So you have something which is a prerequisite for linguistic reference. So both the mother and the baby, each of them can direct and follow the other's attention. And often this takes place also in a format of joint action in which the caretaker and the infant are actually doing something together, using an object together. Like, for example, the mother may be feeding the baby with a cup and drawing attention to that cup and so on and so forth. So you've got the whole routine of participation in joint action as well as joint attention. And sometimes this basic situation is called the referential triangle because it's got a triangular kind of structure to it, which then becomes elaborated into the next stage of intersubjective communication, which involves semiotic mediation, referring by symbolizing. And of course, by symbolizing, usually but not always, with words. So, for example, the child might say something like drink, or they might produce a word in combination with a gesture, such as a pointing gesture. And that combination itself is clearly by now something which is entering in the realm of symbolization. We have gone beyond signals, and we are already in the domain of symbolization, and a true semiotic triangle, where the symbol is representing this figure in joint attention. And what we are talking about here are the sort of communications which characterize the early utterances or word plus gesture productions of children from maybe 12 to 14 months of age onwards. From then, the way is set for the elaboration of that into true linguistic conceptualization, in which increasing command of the resources of language enables both communicators to use linguistic expressions to schematize referential situations in terms of figure-ground organization against the background of a shared universe of discourse, a shared knowledge of the language. And that, again, this may well be and is a very kind of schematic scenario for the way in which language development occurs, but I think it is a realistic one. And it shows us how, starting from very elementary relationships between two people in communication, simple responsiveness to signals like the gaze of another person can, in the right circumstances and given symbolic semiotic mediation, elaborate into a full-blown linguistic competence. Now, that doesn't happen all at once in ontogenesis. And of course, we can assume that in the case of evolution, which is a slightly different process than just, a mother and a baby, that there was, differences of details in the process and a very long, drawn-out evolutionary process. But nonetheless, there are lessons to be learned, I think, about the emergence of symbolic communication in infancy. The first lesson is the primacy of intersubjectivity, first supported by signal sensitivity. Intersubjectivity is fundamental. And I referred in my first lecture to Terence Deacon's characterization of humans as the symbolic species. I think that we can also quite fairly say that humans are the intersubjective species. But primary intersubjectivity is not initially intentional. Intentionality probably first emerges in praxic action before it emerges in communicative action, by which I mean by the time the baby is just a few months old, they're learning to reach for objects, to push things around, to bring things close to their eyes, to examine them, to reject things as well as to demand them. So intentionality emerges first in praxic action, then in communicative action, and then it is integrated into and co-develops with intersubjectivity, yielding in the end symbolic competences. So the three crucial characteristics of linguistic symbolization are successively emergent in infancy. First, intentionality and intersubjectivity. Second, conventionalization. Even conventional gestures like pointing. Not just conventional words, but conventional gestures and body movements as well. And everybody who's got children knows that there are certain little movements that you make, which you share with the pre-linguistic infant, which have become kind of ritualized and conventionalized between you. And then fourthly, elaboration, which in the end yields systematicity and productivity of a symbolic system. So maybe this does tell us something about how this might have happened in evolution. Because at this point, it's useful to look very briefly. I know we've been going for a long time, and I don't want to spend too much more time lecturing, and you probably don't want to spend too much more time listening. But let's look a little bit at some of the processes which underlie what is called grammaticalization. In grammaticalization theory, linguists look at how languages change over time, how grammars emerge and change. Here are the cognitive functional principles which motivate grammaticalization. One of them is that a lexical item becomes a grammatical item. So, for example, in English, the noun front becomes the preposition in front of. Grammaticalization involves, as I already said, iconicity and analogy based upon imagery and experience, the elaboration of mental spaces, perspective and profiling, and the reduction of morphological marking, whereby a lexeme becomes a morpheme. There is a kind of schema of grammaticalization in language evolution. And it's one which looks a little bit like the schema of development in child language acquisition, in which we start out by a new intentional usage, which is conventionalized and becomes elaborated through its use in the community, and then becomes entrenched as part of the system, which then serves as the basis for new intentional innovations or extensions of usage. And I think that that is something like the way in which language evolved. Once you've got the very first step would have been into something like a proto-language, which was a limited set of symbols of some kind. Not even necessarily verbal symbols, but they could have been symbols which were both verbal and gestural, combined verbal, gestural, and all the rest of it. But very little in the way of a grammar. But this inventory, this proto-language could have stayed stable over time spans of tens of thousands of years, until for some reason or another, some kind of functional pressure set in motion the schema of grammaticalization, which in the end gave us something like evolutionary modern languages. Language development and evolution as a constructionist process involves the increasing semanticization of thought. the increasing guiding of thought by symbolic mediation, and the grammaticalization of speech. And my claim is that the schema of elaboration in ontogenesis recapitulates that in language history and prehistory. Although I'm not claiming that particular stages of development are recapitulated. Let's ask ourselves now a question. When in human prehistory did evolutionary modern human languages emerge? Languages or language. Of course, it's impossible to know this with any certainty. So what I'm saying now is essentially speculation. But I'm just going to point to some interesting facts. Anatomically and genetically modern humans date from 200 to 150,000 years before the present. Between 200 and 150,000 years ago, our species appeared as archaic Homo sapiens. Okay? In other words, they were genetically not that much different. I mean, they were genetically us, effectively, and anatomically they were us as well. Doesn't mean they looked exactly like us, but, you know, their skulls were slightly differently shaped and so on. But we also know from archaeology and paleontology that what archaeologists call the symbolic cultural revolution only kicked in around about 100 to 40,000 years ago. The 40,000 year nearest time dating is from findings in Europe. But findings in other parts of the world suggest that this symbolic cultural revolution occurred perhaps earlier, although 100,000 years ago is the outer limit. It's more likely to have been more like 80,000 years ago or 70,000 years ago, something like that. And what do we mean by the symbolic cultural revolution? Well, I don't have much time to say much about this. What I really mean by that is we have evidence of things like cave painting, artistic representation, so the use of the representational function, as I talked about it this morning. But it goes along with other things as well, which is stylization in the manufacture of tools, more complex materials in the use of tools, and a whole load of other things. But in any case, it's clear that there was this very, very long gap. And if we take these 150,000 years and 100,000 years, or 200,000 years and 100,000 years, there was a long gap between the emergence of our species as a biological species, genetically and anatomically, and what looks like the emergence of true symbolization. So here's a hypothesis. For most, or at least a very large part, of the prehistory of our species, we were not language users, but our species was a proto-language user, using limited but nonetheless symbolic resources. So language as we know it now is a modern cultural invention. And by modern, I mean like several tens of thousands years ago. So I would say in a way that it was the invention or emergence of language that turned our species into true humans, even after the biological emergence of the species. So language didn't come along, I'm suggesting, in one package as part of our genes. Language is something which was made possible by our genetic endowment as a species and all the other behavioral and cognitive capacities that went with this, but it was only potentiated and it had to be actuated under certain cultural circumstances. So my hypothesis is that the symbolic revolution involved the co-evolution of praxic intentionality and intersubjectivity. Neither of these are specifically human, although I think maybe intersubjectivity is, but the elaboration of joint reference to flexible construal is without doubt specifically human. And furthermore, the niche of infancy was the key site of the evolution of symbolization. The emergence of proto-symbolization recruited joint attention capacities subsequently selected for in infancy. The cultural elaboration of the symbolic capacity into evolutionary modern languages was driven by requirements for perspectivization and flexible construal, which probably were attendant on and consequent on social complexification. And there is a story to tell about this, which probably has something to do with the increasing size of human groups during prehistory. And acquisition of language as facilitated by early plasticity in epigenetic development, not programmed as a critical period. Right. I should have said more about epigenesis. I have a feeling that I've lost some slides here, but never mind. I'm not going to say any more because I've been talking for long enough. But I just want to contrast here two views of evolution and development. The traditional view suggests that everything, as it were, everything real, goes on at the evolutionary biological and neurophysiological level, which then has, which causes certain effects or consequences at the individual psychological level, which then has further effects at the social or intersubjective or socio-cultural and normative level. That is very much the traditional view, that evolution is basically driven from the bottom up by biology. And I believe that many cognitive linguists still hold to that view. They think that our language is just a sort of expression of our biological essence, as it were. And I'm trying to put forward an alternative view. An alternative view in which evolutionary biological developments actually have consequences, firstly, at the intersubjective and socio-cultural and normative level, giving rise to the emergence of symbolization, but also of certain communication patterns, particularly between the young of our species, the infants of our species, and their caretakers, and their responsiveness to caretakers, which then have fundamental individual psychological consequences when they capture what's going on at the biological level, because it's at that point that our individual psychology becomes that of what Vygotsky called higher mental processes driven by symbolic and semiotic mediation. And this alternative view, which is the view that I am advancing, is the view of the co-evolution of biology and culture. Thank you very much.